My project is based off of the short story by Hiroshi Yamamoto about a girl's relationship with an AI character. My interpretation focused on contrasting understanding of technology, visualising the start of digital technology in the 1940s alongside AI. Visual inspirations for this project include soft robotics, which inspired the usage of silicon in this project, visible mending, which was inspired by the make, do, and mend scheme, as well as looking at anatomy, specifically in the heart, in the differences in how the characters live. I was given feedback to consider my target audience more, and I found that my project catered towards a modern audience with socially relevant themes such as AI and technology. The audience would realistically be enjoyers of science fiction, leaning more towards a satirical genre. The characters Mirugo and Asami are a vision of friendship and trust within technology, representing Mirugo as refined, upper-class technology, whilst Asami's character is so much more outdated and reserved. My performance context is an advertisement with inspirations from the government advert promoting the Make, Do, and Mend scheme released in 1939. In this context, Mirugo was seen as a device promoting comfort and stability during the war to those affected most. The advertisement also shows the movements which I can draw inspiration from, showing how characters can respond to verbal cues using dynamic upper body movements and in-depth facial expressions. The lighting and colour drew inspiration from the 1939 Wizard of Oz and the utilisation of Technicolor in film to showcase costumes in the performance context. I felt it was necessary to look for a coloured alternative to a black and white film that still reads 40s. The costume for Asami mostly consists of dead stock and second-hand materials, creating the depth of her character's backstory of mending her clothes. Additionally, the practices I've used to ensure that the costume have a long life cycle. For Mirugo's costume, the usage of silicone instead of latex significantly extends the life cycle of this product. Additionally, to create a high shine appearance we commonly associate with AI, other alternatives would have included PVCs and plastics, which silicone has been suggested to be a more sustainable option. The timeline had some minor issues, mostly down to the underestimation on the timing developing wearables. I had originally scheduled 2 weeks, as a portion of the work had been done already during P1X, but the process took an additional 8 weeks. This is something I've learned from, and I can acknowledge that a discussion with my collaborator on timeline should have been discussed. My initial budget was £300 with an estimated spend of £240. In reality, I went over budget by nearly £70. A large amount of the overspend could be down to the addition of a crinoline, which cost about £50 extra. Considering the charges I undertook, this figure is not the worst case scenario. As mentioned, Mirugo is an AI character, reflecting an upper-class ideal of society. Her emotions are pure and calculated, but her presentation in a 40s-style ball dress is luxurious and princess-like, noting to the AI being a princess in the original story. The soft robotics research inspired me to look at Lilith Aeon, a silicon costumed AI, which led me to experiment with the silicon pads you can see. Responding to feedback from P1X, I balanced out the top of the bodice to complement Asami's costume, which I will showcase later. The silhouette of the sleeve is a gathered flounce inspired by classic silhouettes of the era. With the bodice, the intention was to create a silicon circular pattern which appears more visible the closer you are. This makes the AI have a false impression of humanity, where you don't view her as technology until you're close. The pattern was developed from a close-fitting bodice block in P1X, and in fitting the garment I made minor alterations, including curving the busting to flatter the silhouette of the performer. The bones would be steel bones, therefore giving the performer a lack of mobility. I chose this as I felt it to be fitting to the character. As she is an AI, her movement is calculated, not retaining the same mobility of a human. The circuit pattern was produced using a hand-carved lino sheet topped with a layer of silicone and then the chiffon pattern pieces laid on top. Once that cures, I backed it onto naturally dyed calico with coffee to match the skin tone, so the sheerness of the chiffon created an illusion of a smooth frame underneath. When stitching the silicone, I had used baking paper and lots of patience. The bobbin stitch appeared incredibly loose, but with the silicone it was surprisingly durable. I drafted the sleeve from an arm measurement with an excess space so the flounce could fall nicely. The pattern shown was cut from the chiffon and gathered at the top and bottom together, slip-stitched onto the bodice and coated in silicone. Space in the sleeves gave the performer a large range of mobility, as there were parts of the film where she would need to have that range of movement. I chose to use silver eyelets as a fastening, complementing the bright mechanical aspects of her costume and character. The only fault was during the filming some of the eyelets slipped through due to the nature of the silicone. There is a moment when Mirugo is meant to reflect Asami's heartbeat. When developing this idea in P1X, I chose to create a complex wearable which took the reading of Asami's performer's heartbeat and transmitted it wirelessly onto LED strips onto Mirugo's costume. I wanted the effect to be a real authentic heartbeat to show Asami's human nature and how her heart responds to different things. At the end of P1X, I had a functional device using one LED strip but was not operating wirelessly. In March, we were then able to produce a small ring of LEDs working wirelessly. At this point, the next steps are then to add the 6 LED strips. After the unit is soldered and fully coded, it then malfunctions majorly 3 days before filming. I then make a compromise with Zhang Song, removing the heart rate sensor wireless attachment and just producing LED strips with a pre-made animation of a heart rate. This did remove my initial intention of wanting Asami's heart rate to appear naturally and imperfect, but at the moment I had no choice but to opt for a simpler option. After that was done, I went to install it with the batteries and it didn't work. This is the day before filming, so I frantically emailed Zhang Song and he recommends I test it using a wall outlet. This worked, so I now have to plug in the wearables to the wall for them to work. Once they were up and working, I began diffusing the lights with chiffon coated in silicon. Market research shows similar projects using silicon as a diffuser successfully. However, I did not use enough to provide the results similar to the work in Tron like I showed previously. In the chiffon with the LEDs was 2 layers of Rigilin. I had used to hold the strips up lightly and prevent sagging. I had installed the lights into the bodice through gaps I'd left in the stitching previously, and once pushed through I could stitch them into place. I had previously asked Shang Tsung to leave the wires long so that I could hide them. I secured the wires under a piece of wadding on the bodice and put the wires and components in a bag attached to the skirt. If I had the option, I would have liked to find a more innovative and practical approach to storing these components, but given the time frame, that was not possible. I initially wasn't going to do a petticoat as I wanted the ability to see the outline of Mirabelle's legs in the costume, representing the almost human-like nature of her character, but when evaluating the silhouette I felt it was necessary. I created a petticoat with 1 layer of tulle on 3 tiers, inspired by similar petticoats of the era, such as the one from Dior. However, the length and weight of the tulle made it fall and bunch between the performer's legs, severely restricting her movement. I was then recommended by a tutor to make a crinoline inspired by the historical half-scale pictures, as well as looking into bridal petticoats. When consulting with another tutor, she recommended I purchase a crinoline, altering it with gathered tulle to reduce workload and budget strain. The skirt silhouette was inspired by looking at various ball gowns of the era, with exaggerated skirt shapes such as the work of Charles James. The silhouette was produced from 2 circle skirts, one of which was shortened and lengthened to make the skirt full. My initial plan for the silicone was to paint it onto the skirt, using the crinoline and paper as a frame. That way, it would hold a nicer curve as the crinoline silhouette made it very triangular. The silicone dispersed well and even, but the silhouette was still not what I wanted, so I decided to get rid of the crinoline and let it fall naturally, but added 3 layers of short tulle underneath the waistband of the skirt. Before I made the ruffles, I'd run out of fabric. Only after I'd started gathering did I realise the fabric I'd purchased was a different shade than the fabric I was using for the skirt. This is something that bothered me but didn't come across too visible in the film. Asami's character is meant to represent the exaggerated version of the working woman, and also the target audience for the Mirabelle product. She's meant to be a lonely and vulnerable person, showcased by her visible and mended heart. Her silhouette is inspired by women's homeware of the 1940s, contrasting with elements of technology and her wire circulatory system. Her character and costume are heavily influenced by the make, do and mend scheme, showcased in the darning embroidery across her dress. The dress pattern was developed during P1X, starting this project responding to alterations. When I developed the dress, I wanted it to be a close fitting at the top, flaring out to a half circle skirt at the bottom. The bodice being close fitting but not boned give the costume structure and support without limiting the performer's movement. I also wanted the skirt to have flare so that when she moved, it would create a flowing effect, being light and almost effortless. The heart was constructed taking inspiration from millinery techniques, specifically the process of making a skull cap. I hadn't initially planned to make this patchwork. I had the thought, and I felt as though it pushed the narrative of mending as well as the character's vulnerability and desire for love. The mending is also present in patches on the dress and around the heart. I used AI to generate ideas about mending, but I ended up sticking to my original plan of darning hand embroidery. I would have liked to experiment with breaking down processes to emphasise the life cycle of this dress, but it was not possible within this project. The wire vanes were made of aluminium coated in heat shrink tubing, eliminating the risks involved using electrical wires. The wire vanes were twisted, glued and painted to create the maximum anatomical effect inspired by the circulatory system. When assembling all the components together, I took extra precaution minimising skin contact and maximising freedom of movement. The wires were pushed through embroidered eyelets and sewn into the heart, which was then backed in wadding. When I was tacking the wires into place, I left extra slack so that no matter the movement, they'd be supported, as well as avoiding tight places like the armhole. The blend of technology and anatomy in this component showcases Asami's human approach to technology, linking her back to the 1940s Colossus computer. In my narrative, Asami enters in a coat, removing it to reveal her mended heart. My initial design, although supporting the reserved nature of her character, lacked elements relating to the era and technology industry. I adapted the silhouette to change these elements, also bringing in previous research into the Colossus computer and the punch cards they used to operate them. The coat was developed from the dress pattern, making minor tweaks to develop it further. I added in welt pockets to the front panels and seam pockets, as the 40s style was very utilitarian. Therefore, I wanted the coat to maintain elements of practicality, especially considering Asami's status as a working woman. I experimented with the wool punch cards using brassy eyelets to keep the muted colour palette. The method of applying these made them very wonky and abstract, which I actually found to be quite fitting to the contextual research. In the screen test, I wanted to experiment with lighting and how the light reflects different interpretations of the character. I found that backlighting for Asami's character made her seem negative, which gave me avenues to explore when in my film when she has moments of sadness. With Mirabelle's character, the brighter the setting, the better. The silicone showed well on head-on lighting. Although I cannot accommodate both in the same time, it gives me an idea to decide what is more important for each scene. The narrative in my storyboard shows them changing locations multiple times. This opens up the possibility for different lightings. As I was producing an advertisement, I needed a script. This was where I was able to utilise digital experimentation in AI software to assist me in producing a script. I had asked ChatGPT to make me a basic script responding to some prompt emotions in the original story. From that, I could change and add additional research for context within my narrative. I had the opportunity to rehearse the lines with my performers and discuss the characters' actions, as there isn't much performative movement, it is more about how they interact with the space. The location was kindly lent to me by the videographer, which gave me the opportunity to go in prior to shooting and rehearse some of the movements in relation to the space. I also was able to make a mock-up of how I planned to dress the set, taking inspiration from 40s living rooms, as well as assistance of digital experimentation with AI. The day of filming went smoothly with all cast and crew prepared. On set we had myself, 2 performers, the videographer, the sound recordist and the photographer who stepped in last minute after my previous photographer cancelled. Although not on set, we had the additional cast member of Dan who did the male voiceover for the film. As stated on the call sheet, I arrived at 8 to set up alongside the videographer, ready for an 11 AM start. We ended up working quite fast, finishing at 2 instead of the expected 5. Prior to filming, I had coordinated with the performers to do their own hair and makeup using a mood board I had provided. The processes I have undergone for this project have, as a whole, been very successful. For the character of Mirror Girl, I had several obstacles which I was able to adapt to. To develop this project further, I would have liked to have completed my initially intended wearable, but I can reflect on the fact that a lot of the issues came down to overcomplications and miscommunications, and I wasn't fully aware of the difficulty of the project. Additionally, on a reflection, my budget did not accommodate my vision in terms of quantity of silicone. I would have loved to have coated the skirt in even more silicone, but due to its price, that wasn't possible. Both the coat and dress came out well for Asami, with my only reflection being that I would have scheduled more time on mending. I would have loved to have had another patch or 2, or potentially add other types of mending as well as breaking down processes. The filming process came out very well, with the final film matching my initial vision. The advertisement at moments does feel very narrative based, but in modern day advertisements from companies such as John Lewis, these are quite common. My only dilemma in filming was that the atmosphere and scenario didn't highlight the lights enough. We had recorded close-up footage of the lights, but flow of the film it looked misplaced, so I would have liked to have highlighted that aspect of the costume more. I believe the costumes I showcased in the film were very professional in the performance setting, and they complemented the narrative well. That being said, if I was to lean into more of the dystopian and science fiction approach with Mirror Girl's character, I believe this would have read better as an AI.